On the 14th of August 1914 at 10:45, a meeting was held that changed the history of the United Kingdom forever. King George V, knowing what this meeting meant for his people, looked over the table at his Prime Minister, Lord Asquith, who equally knew the magnitude of this moment. King George would call it a terrible catastrophe, but not the fault of the people, signed the document declaring that the country was now officially at war. "Please to God," he wrote in his diary, "may it soon be over." Even before the onset of war, Britain had been preparing. In 1912, the Railway Executive Committee was formed with the task of managing the railways should the prospect of war arise. Over 130 railways were drafted into the scheme, with only 18 abstaining. This also included the giants of the Great Western Railway and the Great North Railway. The Railway Executive Committee also made provisions for the running of special troop and goods trains to strategic points around the country, like the towns of Southampton and Dover. The committee did not account on one glaring problem, however. The railway industry was a male-dominated environment, so when the call was made to go to war, thousands of able-bodied men left their posts to fight. Over 185,000 men left the railway, leaving the majority of the network at a standstill. 400 stations were forced to close due to lack of staff, and smaller local trains were cancelled due to lack of drivers. So to compensate, retired workers were brought back in, and women were also employed to do the work of the men. Thanks to the efforts of everyone, the workforce increased by over 68,000 women, and a restriction was placed on male railway workers that had not yet gone to war, preventing them from enlisting. The railway workers were not too happy. They had seen what happened to men who didn't enlist. Nearly 18,000 men, known as conscientious objectors, refused to enlist either due to religious or other means. Quite often these men were publicly named and shamed, and often shunned by communities, with some men even being beaten and outcasted. The railwaymen, fearing this shunning, petitioned to have some form of identifier showing that they were exempt due to their work, so the committee gave the men pin badges showing that they were on the King's service for their railway and showed their status. Meanwhile, way up north in Scapa Flow, in the Orkney Islands, in the wake of the announcement, a new fleet of naval warships were mobilising under the Admiralty command of Sir John Jellicoe. Lord Jellicoe himself was a force to be reckoned with. He came from a long line of seafarers. His great-great-grandfather was Second Sea Lord of the Admiralty, answering only to Lord Horatio Nelson. Both him and Lord Nelson fought side by side in the 1805 Battle of Trafalgar, and after Nelson's last victory and his sad passing, his great-great-grandfather helped the triumphant yet mournful fleet home. Lord Jellicoe's father himself made the ranks of captain and was well respected in the town of Southampton. Lord Jellicoe from a young age proved to have the very same energy and lust for life as his forefathers. He was never scared of anything and loved being close to the sea. He wanted to go into the family business and told his father he wanted to join the Navy as soon as he was able. Just before his 13th birthday, John entered the Royal Navy as a cadet. He trained on the training ship Britannia and excelled in his studies. He was promoted to midshipman, but had risen through the ranks quickly, becoming one of the youngest lieutenants in the fleet. John spent many years at sea. During that time, he protected and gave defence over the Suez Canal during the Egyptian War, earned a bronze medal for gallantry for trying to save the crew of a scuttled steamer during a storm, and nearly drowned in the process. And when the ship he was serving under as lieutenant commander was accidentally struck and started to sink, he was woken by his servant, but instead of leaping off the ship to safety, he stood on the bridge, ushering those below to hurry and abandon ship, until he himself was forced to leap into the sea. John encouraged the men to swim for their lives, knowing full well what would happen when the red-hot boilers in the hull hit the freezing water. The explosion rocked the nearby ship and killed many men, but John survived, which is made even more incredible, in fact, that John at the time was almost delirious with fever caused by malaria. 4 years later, John made the rank of captain and went to fight in a war in China. Despite being severely wounded, he was awarded the Commander of the Order of the Bath. In 1911, he became a Rear Admiral, a Vice Admiral, an Admiral, and then Second Sea Lord of the Admiralty. The British naval fleet at the time was a force no other country had ever seen before. Sir John, who was now the First Sea Lord of the Admiralty, knew it wasn't enough. So he took 2 fleets from the home fleets and merged them to create the Great Fleet. 160 warships and over 200,000 able-bodied naval officers were drafted to protect the islands and naval bases along the string of islands away from the mainland, while Scapa Flow itself received a huge defence upgrade. Scapa Flow was perfect for the Grand Fleet. Its 60-metre natural harbour, surrounded by several islands, made it perfect to moor a large number of vessels. In history, the towns of Portsmouth, Plymouth, Southampton and Dover were the preferred spots for mounting a defence from European intruders. But as the Germans started to build up its fleet, it was quickly realised that the entrance to the North Sea from the north was overexposed and a base was required. From the start of the war, the railways already had a route established from South Wales to Grangemouth in Edinburgh. The cargo was strictly coal to feed the boilers of the warships, but the long journey gave rise to another. It was known that because the larger ports were in the south of the country, moving hundreds of thousands of seamen to the northern borders was not going to be easy. Neither was getting them home on leave. Currently, this would have meant having to take several different trains to get home, taking days and bringing morale to an all-time low. A new route was proposed by the government, which would allow these men to travel from Euston station to Thurso, directly where a boat would take them to Scapa Flow. The route would be a staggering 717 miles long, the longest ever single route proposed by rail. The train was nicknamed the Jellicoe Express, but for the men that travelled on it, it was called the Misery. The men were cramped and jostled on carriages. If the men were small enough, they were lucky enough to sleep on the luggage racks, and seating was at a premium. Over 300 people packed into stuffy carriages for a train ride that lasted on average 23 hours, and many men would stand for most of the journey. The Misery was very aptly named. The train ran on a single track once a day. Luckily for the travellers, the Jellicoe did allow for stops. At the stops, alongside getting coal and water and for the engine and following a change of crew if required, along the route scores of women, their men already fighting on the front, would swarm the platform, giving the weary men much needed food and water. Between these and the special Jellicoe coal trains, 44,000 tonnes of coal and over 500,000 men were moved up and down the country, feeding the Grand Fleet and protecting the shoreline. In 1917, Lord Jellicoe's work began to creep upon him, and he started to suffer with his health. He decided that in the best interest of all, that he stepped away from the Grand Fleet. In recognition, the King bestowed on him the Viscount Jellicoe of Scapa, with Vice Admiral Sir Roslin Wyners taking up the first Sea Lord in succession. The last Jellicoe train in World War I left on the 30th of April 1919, and few thought that the need for the train would come again. However, in 1939 the trains were called on. This time though, a demand for coal at Scapa Flow had lessened, as many warships now run on oil or diesel refined fuels rather than steam. But the movement of men was still required, so the trains continued. While the journey was still miserable, the time it took to get to Scapa Flow was reduced thanks to technology improvements. Yesterday marked the day when the guns fell silent, and tomorrow we pay homage to those who gave the ultimate sacrifice. Up and down the Jellicoe line, plaques are being unveiled on platforms to commemorate the Jellicoe Express and where it stopped. The plaques give a brief history of England's longest single journey, and it is dedicated to the men and women that travelled and worked upon it.